This epistolary account was found in the parking lot of an abandoned strip mall by a group of teenagers. They brought it to a police station, believing it to be something worth money, considering the obviously old parchment on which the letter was written. Unsure of its value, the officers handed it over to me, the town's humble historian, and I've transcribed the odd, fantastical account for you here, omitting nothing. There were 6 of us at the start of the day. My friend, a guy named Ted who was obsessed with exploring abandoned and derelict places, found an old strip mall outside of town, one that had been abandoned after a fire started in one of the stores and spread to the others, destroying the entire stretch. And despite the loss of employment suffered by the nearby community, it hadn't been rebuilt or completely torn down and built over. Something had stopped the community from tending to the ruins, so the land was left alone, dark and ashen, forsaken even by our town's local government. They had somehow suppressed news of the fire in the days after, for a reason that I wished I hadn't found out. Ted, upon discovering this gem of ruin, immediately told us about it and insisted that we all visit. He had said that we needn't worry about violating any trespassing laws because of the aforementioned communal neglect. No one, he assured us, cared about the half-collapsed line of buildings. There were never any cars parked in the weed-invaded lot. Having nothing else to do on a Thursday night, we quickly agreed to explore the site, even though none of us had any belief that we would find anything interesting. We had all heard that the place had been plundered of any items that had survived the fire in the first week following the destruction. We were sure that the best we would find would be a scorched t-shirt, or maybe a creepily carbonized mannequin. We of course found such things, items reduced to charred remnants of their former selves, but we also found something worse, something both alive and dead. Even though it was unlikely that we would be noticed, we went at night, parking on the street opposite the lot, and crossing by the guidance of the moon's light, which shone freely and totally over the cracked and dilapidated lot. It was totally vacant. No cars rested within the half-mile of trash-littered blacktop. I wore a black hoodie, dark jeans, and black boots, and almost everyone else dressed the same, with the exception of Jeff, stupid Jeff, who had worn a white t-shirt and green shorts. Jeff didn't last long, but things went south. We crept into an ordinary clothes store at first. It was the least destroyed, despite being situated not far from the initial site of the conflagration, a copy and print shop. The store's walls had been blackened by the heat but hadn't fallen. A few posters even remained, albeit melted to the surfaces, their designs and words unintelligible. The counters were in similar states, blackened but otherwise sturdy. The clothes that were on the racks, however, had all been burned away, and the floor was littered with the remains of shoes and whatever else the store had sold. As expected, there was nothing of interest to be found, so we left and went into the next store to our left, closer to the place where the disastrous blaze had been born. The next door, some sort of electronic shop, had suffered greatly in the disaster. The wall that connected it to the next door in the leftward sequence was utterly destroyed, as if something affixed to it had exploded. Shelves and counters had been blasted away, and only a few scraps of plastic had survived the tempest. Unusual pieces of electronics and gadgetry, nothing salvageable. Disappointed by the lack of loot, but awed at the level of destruction, we climbed over what was left of the blasted wall and crossed into the next door, a perfume and cologne shop. Despite the fire which had raged through, the scents of the product still lingered, even amidst the stench of burnt plastic and whatever had comprised the walls. The chemically engineered scents were prevalent. It was as if the heat had intensified the pleasant and unpleasant smells to an almost olfactorily obnoxious potency. Images of salesmen and women simultaneously filling the air with spray samples flashed into my mind as I waded through the veritable atmosphere of perfume. The next door was a game shop, one with which I was very familiar, having been there several times back before I converted to digital media. Melted clumps of plastic, the fused remains of game cases littered the floor, blackened slag-like mounds that smelled terrible. The heat had done awful things to this room, transforming the once colorful, hype-inducing space into a nightmarish heap of flame-scorched ruin. As expected, we found nothing worth scavenging, and doubted that anything of value had even survived the blaze. It was here that things began to go terribly wrong. While sitting on a charred counter, leafing through a barely legible magazine he had found within a box beneath the counter, my friend Adam was suddenly draped in darkness, as if a veil had been thrown over him, preventing the moonlight from shining on that particular area. The localized darkness was total. Adam simply vanished from sight. He had been talking about an up-and-coming game which he had seen an ad for in the magazine, so all of us had been looking at him when he vanished. Jeff, not sensing the impending danger, perceived Adam's vanishing as something cool, and rushed to the undarkened spot, presumably to also encompass himself in the eerie absence of light. When he reached the spot, he disappeared as well. And despite the then inexplicable nature of disappearances, we all felt compelled to follow, sensing, with that inner, usually dormant animal sense, that our friends were in grave danger. One by one, the rest of us stepped into the lightless space. I was the last to enter, and that same sense which had warned me of my friend's certain doom also impelled me to hesitate. It would have made me retreat entirely, but I was determined to help my friends. So I stepped into the darkness. I should have left them all behind and gone home to some semblance of sanity and safety. The dark space had turned out to be a portal, a lacuna in our reality, some dimensional oversight that had been lazily covered up aeons ago by spatial patchwork that was undone by the violence of the fire. Or maybe the seal had at some point been sturdy, solid, but was over time weakened by something from the other side, something that had chipped away at it, century after century, and the fire had simply peeled away the last flimsy layer. I don't have the answers. I haven't learned the mechanics behind this nightmare. I just know that presently, I'm trapped here, and can only hope that my message reaches someone, somewhere. Despite its tenebrous portal, the space beyond the threshold of darkness was not devoid of light. I saw my friends illuminated clearly beneath a rusted chandelier, one that had probably been beautiful many millennia ago, but was now a faded shadow of its former self. There were 8 stems which curved from the central structure, but only 4 of the sconces held candles that burned. It was still impressive that those 4 had remained lit throughout the unknowable cycles, the flames subsisting on the stale air, tirelessly casting their light to an unoccupied room. The room in which we had unwittingly entered was scarcely furnished, and ostensibly built into some subterranean domain. The walls were bare rock, as was the floor in areas that weren't covered by thick crimson rug, which extended from the site of our arrival into a rocky corridor beyond. The corridor was lined with white crosses, which increased in size as you neared the end of the corridor. We left the apparent antechamber of this otherworldly space, walking slowly along a single file, and reading the gold-plated inscriptions mounted beneath the crosses. Initially, the inscriptions were unreadable, not due to the wearing of time but simply indecipherable from a linguistic perspective, bearing messages in languages that not one of us could begin to identify. It wasn't until we had reached halfway down the corridor that we began to recognize languages. Latin, Greek, other languages that Jeff indelicately described as some kind of European, and English eventually. As we moved forward, the process was reversed. We encountered languages barely recognizable, and then inscriptions written in words and symbols that seemed to belong to species other than ours, completely alien to anything we had seen before. But one thing all the languages had in common was the issuance of a warning, an ominous call to turn back. The message in English read, "It is here the undying has been confined. Should you find yourself delving into this unhallowed place, I beseech you to turn back. If you seek death, you will not find him here. He shuns this abysmal hall as sewer rats shun the light. The Lord, even in the infinitude of his being, has conveniently forgotten to cast his light here. I do not know from what country, plant, or time that you have come, but if you are able, you must return. It is not death that awaits you, but the perversion of life." But like fools we pressed on. Were drawn deeper into the corridor by that self-sacrificing curiosity, which always coincides with fearful experiences of the supernatural. We were certain that the other inscriptions, despite our collective monolingual inadequacy, imparted these same ominous warnings. The corridor terminated in a barred iron door, and the crosses on the walls beside it were just as tall as its seemingly impregnable frame. A bar the size of my arm prevented the door from swinging outward, though this precaution seemed like an afterthought, compared to the various sigils and runes complexly engraved upon the door's surface. The design, if you looked at them collectively, was a sort of amalgam of greater symbols, curiously ordered groupings of sigils that were then linked together at the center to form a single massive image. It was beautiful yet foreboding, in an intense, inexpressible way. There was a sense of community about the image, the apparent result of cooperation between entities that, as wild as this may sound, were perhaps not of the same terrestrial order, not of the same species. We stared in awe at the door, momentarily forgetting the unsettlingly cryptic circumstances. We were suddenly terribly reminded of our predicament when, from behind the door, there came a voice. A single word was spoken, but intoned within this utterance were suggestions of pitiful helplessness, of incomprehensible woe. The word that was spoken was hungry. We were all simultaneously overcome by a sensation of unprecedented empathy, and despite having not received any sort of instruction, we began vocally undoing the almost mythical locks that had been immemorially inscribed upon the door. Somehow, we were given insight into the languages which comprised the esoteric image. I found myself reciting strings of words that I hadn't ever before uttered, haven't ever seen written or heard spoken. We were as some inhuman choir speaking aloud the oftentimes rhythmic incantations, which, despite the bizarreness of it all, seemed rather harmless to us at least. There was even a warmth that swelled within me as my mouth formed these strange, entirely unfamiliar word shapes. Regardless of which language we spoke, each grouping seemed to belong to a different syntax. There was always a feeling of spirituality, a multicultural, multi-species intent towards good. It was clear when we had spoken the last of the benevolently sorcerous words that several civilizations had at some time come together to seal something abominably profane behind this door. The lines and shapes of the great image flashed blindingly, but then faded away, leaving the door's surface entirely blank and the iron bar drawn back. The door was unlocked. Jeff, emboldened by curiosity or merely stupidity, pulled back the door, revealing another smaller antechamber, though there is no hallway that separated it from another smaller door beyond. In this space, which was no larger than your average bedroom, was a simple, modeled metal chair, a wooden writing desk, and a small, floor-level cot, a single white sheet tucked neatly into the wooden frame. The walls were just like those before it, and a single sconce was mounted to each, the candles therein still burning. There is a hole in the corner of the floor, to the right of the doorway, only 2 feet away from the cot. Based on the dark smears around the hole, it was obvious what its purpose had been for the sole occupant of the room. The darkly robed occupant sat in the chair, slumped over the desk, its skull eerily illumined by the candlelight. Shocked speechless, or perhaps delayed in returning to the simple mode of speech with which we had been accustomed to all our lives, we silently circled around the desk, although none of us ventured too close to the second door, which too closely resembled one befitting some ancient dungeon. The figure, the corpse slumped over the desk, was dressed in some sort of ceremonial garb or religious vestments. Their hands, just bones, rested in their lap, as if the person had simply dozed off in the middle of reading. The book beneath the desk-laying skull was unreadable, though not because of the language that was easily recognizable as English. The pages themselves had been yellowed by time, the words faded by ceaseless exposure to those inexhaustible candles, and undoubtedly by the secretions and gaseous emanations of the body's decomposition. But written upon a shadowed portion of the desk in what I hoped was ink, but knew to be blood, was an elegiac message. Today, my vigil ends. Today, I die. I who volunteered as jailer to this wretched thing, consign the horror to these walls, though I know that they will crumble to ruin long before it feels the slightest hint of true death. If you have breached the door and entered this room, there is no hope for you. You have, woefully or not, forfeited your life. I suggest that you end it now, by whatever means available to you. Although, despite my ordinarily unyielding faith, I fear that only the atoms of my body will be free. I fear that my soul will remain locked in this room, without the flesh to protect it from the wickedness before me. Goodbye, but I pray that this message reaches no soul, and that my final words fade unheeded along with my bones. Ted, the one who had insisted we visit the burned-out strip mall, broke the silence first. I'm sorry guys, I had no idea about any of this. Claire, who had remained largely silent through the adventure turned nightmare, clutched her boyfriend's arm for comfort. But Adam was focused on something ahead of us, the closed-in shadow-steeped cell a few meters away. Before any of us could ask what was wrong, beyond the obvious wrongness of our situation, Adam started to whimper. His voice came out softly, pleadingly, as if he were unintelligibly begging someone to end a long-endured torment. Claire's grip tightened, now offering comfort to the man she had sought it from, but he paid no attention to her, and even fell to his knees, defeated, still begging in an inarticulate way. None of us knew what to do, and I, perhaps because I had been standing the furthest away from the cell and had a better vantage of the overall scene, saw an immediate connection between Adam's sudden and sourceless suffering and the unknown thing locked within the cell. Instinctively, I retreated from Adam and, by extension, from the thing beyond, accidentally nudging my cousin Alicia in the process. She turned to me and then to Adam, and made the connection herself, silently retreating alongside me to the doorway behind us. Claire knelt beside Adam, futilely questioning him, while Ted and Jeff stood over them, staring dumbly at the scene. When Adam seized Claire by the throat and, in an exhibition of strength that was impressive even for a healthy guy in his 20s, threw her into the bars of the cell. Alicia and I both leapt out of the room, simultaneously sensing some dark and inimical change in the atmosphere. Ted tackled Adam to the floor, where they clumsily wrestled. The room was not large enough to accommodate such an interaction, while Jeff went to Claire's aid. I mentioned earlier that Jeff was the first to die because of his overzealous stupidity. Automatically going to help Claire was a stupid decision, yes, but one that, due to his ignorance of the thing within the cell, was justified. The monumentally and mortally stupid decision was remaining at the cell after helping Claire up and peering into the abundant darkness therein. Claire, somewhat dizzied by her headfirst impact against the cell bars, stumbled over to Alicia, while Ted held Adam down on the jailer's perfectly made cot. Adam, throughout the short-lived skirmish, continued to whine, only now his pleading became hysterical. Ted motioned for us to step aside, and he dragged the manic Adam out of the room. Jeff was the only one left inside. He had his face pressed against the bars, straining to see something through the darkness which somehow withstood the light thrown by the candles throughout the room. We called out to him, pleaded with him to leave the room so that we could close the door, but he waved his hand at us and said that he could almost make out something in the back of the cell. But something told me that the cell had no back, no end in the traditional sense, and that the darkness was, in fact, unnatural. A thing cast off, exuded, the photic inverse of the candlelight. Jeff, either finally relenting to our pleas or simply giving up his endeavor, finally pulled himself away from the bars, or rather, he tried to. His body retreated a few inches, but was otherwise anchored in place by his head, which seemed to be affixed to the bars. His face wedged beneath two of the eerily lustrous poles. We all collectively silenced our voices, sensing again that some new incident of terror had arisen. Jeff lightly struggled to free himself, feigning calmness, but this act was short-lived and he soon began echoing Adam's previous frenzied behavior. The trapped man flailed about and jerked his body in a manner that had to have been incredibly painful for his neck and head. I shouted for him to stop. Claire screamed. Ted wrestled again with Adam behind us, who had once again come to life in a fit of mania. The awful, scream-silencing crack sounded louder than any other sound I had heard that abysmal night. Jeff's body hung limply at an angle from the head, which was still wedged between the ensnaring bars. From the way the body sagged, it was obvious that the life within had been extinguished, that the resounding crack had been the breaking of Jeff's neck, or perhaps the frontward collapse of his skull. No one bothered to call out. No one dared to break the silence. I would have closed the door then, would have allowed my friend's body to remain unburied within that dismal prism tomb, if it hadn't been pushed into the room from behind. I turned to see Adam's crazed face shrinking. No, before swiftly covered by the closing door. I saw Ted on the floor behind him, blood running from a wound on his head, and a bloodied flashlight rolling down the carpet. Alicia and Claire were pressed against the leftward wall, petrified by fright at Adam's sudden, monstrous act. Just before the door closed, I saw Adam turn to the shocked girls, and then silence reigned as the door completely shut, the physical and mystical locks sealing themselves. I was trapped in the jailer's room, though not alone. A long-dead corpse and Jeff's fresh body were my charnel roommates. To say that I panicked isn't exactly accurate. I was terrified, of course, but the feeling that overcame me, the bodily sensation which stiffened my limbs and clouded my mind, was less of a state of panic, and more of a total spiritual depletion, an unwilling but nonetheless complete existential forfeiture. There was the certainty that I was trapped here, that even if Alicia and Claire somehow managed to overpower the hysterical and murderous Adam, they wouldn't be able to undo the door locks that I somehow knew would require several voices to be undone. There was also the uncertainty regarding how long I would remain alive, not because of the entity or presence within the chamber, which I felt sure was not presently able to leave, but because of dehydration and starvation. I was vaguely aware that I could survive maybe 2 weeks without food, but water was a more pressing matter, and I hadn't had so much as a sip for several hours now. The air in the room thankfully seemed inexhaustible, which I judged by the endlessly burning candles. Despite being only meters away from the bar door and Jeff's still slumped corpse, I felt confident that I would not face physical harm, so long as I did not enter the area immediately before it. I sat in the cot, which was unyielding to my weight, an uncomfortably firm surface that I couldn't imagine having slept on night after night, year after year. There was a faint stench about the air, though I wasn't sure if it was from the aging corpse or Jeff's, or from something within the cell. This, of course, inspired a new fear, the idea that I would die from choking upon the miasmal vapors of decomposition. I rose from the cot and went over to the desk, careful not to disturb the corpse, which I feared would crumble to dust at the slightest touch. I scanned the surface and then, after gently moving the corpse-occupied chair aside, found a drawer. I opened it and found a journal which, like the blood-written words on the desk, was written in English. The journal detailed the life of the late jailer, which I won't diminish or disrespect by clumsily copying here. There was very little to do with the owner's present situation, which was entirely understandable. If I were in his position, willingly I should add, I'd probably want to reflect on the less horrible portions of my life as well. There was only one thing worth retelling. One section briefly covered near the end, but not at the end, discussed the prospect of communication with people outside the jail's confines. I scanned this section several times, making sure that I had not misread or misunderstood the bleak pronouncement. It essentially called for a spiritual Hail Mary, a final, irreversible attempt at exo-dimensional contract. Here is the short passage. Should the vampire escape or achieve an animacy resembling life, the jailer may unburden himself of his own life and allow his spirit to act as a courier of his word. After saying the requisite incantation and absolving oneself of any graver than usual sins, the speaker's soul, encumbered with the necessary thoughts or messages, may traverse the outward gulfs to visit any desired locale and deliver to its people the final message of the vampire's awakening. If, however, no such event has occurred, then it is strictly forbidden to use this means of deathly communication. The incantation was written at the bottom, and due to its grim and essentially magical nature, I will not relate it. As you might have guessed by your reception of this posthumous account, I performed the forbidden rite. Using a pen retrieved from within the same drawer, I unceremoniously punctured my neck, with the steadiness of hand and peace of mind that were only possible because of the certainty that alternate phase, indefinite residency in the jail would be far worse. I staggered, leaving the pen in my neck, and fell against the wall. My head nudged one of these sconces and the candle came tumbling out, falling onto the floor and rolling towards the cell. My vision blurred as the blood drained from me, and after suppressing a final animalistic desire to undo my act, I collapsed to the floor beside Jeff's corpse and the candle. Still burning, the candle cast its light into the gloom-draped cell. Somehow at this proximity, the flame's light managed to pierce the darkness, finally revealing the interior. Jeff's bar-wedged face, a meter above me, was in the process of some horrible spectral dissolution. Atom by atom, it was being drawn away towards the opposite end of the cell, the destination of the particles, a figure affixed to the far wall. Filthy rags or sagging blackened flesh hung from its titan-sized body, which was crucified upside down upon a sigil carved stone cross. An image not dissimilar to the one on the outside door had been drawn upon the massive wall behind the crucified figure. Although, unlike the image on the door, this image had been heavily worn by time, or the cell's assuredly unnatural atmospheric properties. As my life waned, I came to understand some of the truth, realized dimly the nature of the being imprisoned within this loathsome tomb. It was, and it still is, some kind of vampire, but one of a predatory order well beyond the folkloric entities with which we're all aware. There was a dark and dormant vitality about the thing, an essence of undeath that, though not conscious, was nonetheless powerful, spiritually potent in a way which can still induce hysteria and fits of violence in those who come into contact with it. Adam's mania was one side effect of such exposure, Jeff's bodily magnetism another. Why none of the others or myself never suffered some ill effect, I do not know. Perhaps due to the unconscious and therefore unfocused exertion of power, the effects being random and direct, the ultra-resilient and undoubtedly wicked soul merely grasping at whatever it could find to reanimate the corpse, its home. Bleeding out takes a long time, at least longer than I would have thought. In the moments that have passed since my collapsing to the floor, the vampire's body is not stirred. Jeff's face is now almost entirely absent. His glistening skull peers sightlessly towards that impartially resurrected revenant. I'm not scared anymore, just tired. I doubt Jeff's body alone will suffice for the vampire's necromantic rejuvenation. I doubt any small number of victims will. For a creature that has ravaged worlds that required the cooperation of star-crossed races to subdue and imprison, I doubt anything short of a great population would be enough. I suppose that in and of itself is a comfort, that my body following Jeff's will not sufficiently invigorate the thing. But with a morbid curiosity, I do wonder at what the creature is like when fully sated, truly alive. The sheer power must be both awe-inspiring and blackly nightmarish. This death-defying entity able to exude its vampiric influence, send forth its appalling thoughts and animus into the fragile minds who come near it. Even in death, a devil can still dream.